Welcome to Sleepy Harbour. Tonight we are going to spend a long, slow while inside the life of a man who said he did not sleep. And I want you to notice, right at the start, how strange that is. You have come here to drift off, to let the day loosen its grip on you, and I am going to tell you the story of someone who claimed he barely closed his eyes at all. 2 hours a night. That is the figure. 2 hours a night, and the rest of the dark hours spent working, thinking, building things in a mind that never seemed to want to rest. He said it himself. He said it to journalists, to admirers, to anyone who asked how one person could produce so much. 2 hours. And you, right now, are lying still, letting your breath go long and even, doing the one thing he claimed he could do without. There is a gentleness in that irony, and we will sit inside it together for a good long while. So let me make you a small promise before we go any further, and then let me leave it hanging over the whole night like a lamp left burning in a far window. He said he slept 2 hours a night. The people who watched him work, the people who shared his rooms and his laboratories and his dinners, described something rather different. They described naps. They described long, heavy recovery sleeps after his marathon stretches of work. We will get there. We will follow the whole thread of it, slowly, all the way to the end. But not yet. First, there is a life to walk through, and it is a very long and very human one, and it begins in a small village a long way from anywhere. And it ends in a hotel room high above a loud American city, alone with a pigeon at the window. Hold on to both of those, the 2-hour claim and the quiet room. We will come back to them the way the tide comes back, in its own unhurried time. Let us begin at the end, actually, just for a moment, because it is the calmest place to stand. Picture a room. Room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, 33 floors up, in Manhattan, in the winter of 1943. It is January. The city outside is cold and grey and enormous, all that noise and traffic and electric light, and none of it reaches into this room. Inside, it is quiet. There is an old man here, 86 years old, tall and very thin, dressed with the careful neatness of someone who has always cared how he looked, even when there was no one left to see. His name is Nikola Tesla, and once, a long time ago, this man lit up Niagara Falls. Once, the power that ran through the walls of half a continent flowed out of ideas he had first drawn in the dirt with a stick. And now he lives here, in a rented room, owing money, feeding the birds that come to his window, mostly forgotten by the world that his work had quietly rebuilt. He died in that room, alone, on the 7th of January 1943. A maid found him. And afterward, men from the United States government came and took away his papers, boxes of notes and drawings, to see whether there was anything dangerous or valuable inside them. But that is the very end of the thread, and we have the whole of it to unwind before we arrive there. I only wanted you to see the room first, to know where this slow road leads, a quiet room, high above the city, a life almost over, a man who once claimed he did not sleep, now resting for good. Let that image settle in you, let it be soft. We are in no hurry at all. And before we go on, since we are going to be together for a long while tonight, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Whatever harbour you have drifted into this evening, whatever city or quiet town or dark bedroom, if you feel like it, leave a word below and tell me. It is a comfort, in a story about a man who ended up so alone, to remember how many of us are out here in the dark together. And if you are new here, and you would like more of these slow, careful journeys to help you find your way to sleep, you might quietly subscribe. No rush. The birds will still be at the window. Let us go back to the beginning. Now we travel back, far back, more than 80 years before that quiet hotel room. We go across an ocean and across a continent to a small village called Smiljan, in a region that was then part of the Austrian Empire, in a stretch of land known as the military frontier. Today that country is called Croatia. But in the summer of 1856 it was a rural, hilly, forested place of stone houses and Orthodox churches and small farms, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the seasons turn slowly and the nights are very dark and very full of stars. And here is where the legend begins, so let me tell it to you as a legend, because that is what it is, and it is a lovely one. The story goes that Nikola Tesla was born in the middle of the night, on the 9th going into the 10th of July, 1856, during a great thunderstorm. Lightning was cracking over the hills, so the story says, and as the child came into the world, the midwife, frightened by the storm, called him a child of the storm. And his mother, lying there exhausted and holding her newborn son, is said to have answered, "No, no, he will be a child of light." Now, I want to be honest with you, because being honest with you is part of what makes this a calm place to rest. That story is almost certainly too perfect to be true. It comes down to us from family retelling, not from any document, not from any record written at the time. It is the kind of story that gets shaped and polished in the years afterward, when a small child has grown into a famous man and everyone wants his beginning to match his ending. A child of light, born in a storm, who would spend his whole life wrestling with electricity, with lightning made by human hands. It is too neat. Real life is rarely that neat. So we will not treat it as fact. We will treat it as the first of many beautiful stories that gathered around this man like moths around one of his own lamps. But I will say this. Whether or not the lightning cracked over Smiljan that particular night, there is something fitting in it, and I think you can enjoy the fittingness of it without needing it to be literally so. A child who would one day pull man, made lightning out of the sky, born, so the family liked to say, under a real one. Let the story be a story. It costs us nothing, and it is a soft thing to hold. What we do know, more soberly, is the family he was born into. His father was a man named Milutin Tesla, a priest in the Serbian Orthodox Church. The Tesla family were ethnic Serbs living in that frontier country, and Milutin was a thoughtful, literate man, a man of words and sermons and books, who wanted his sons to follow him into the church. Picture a village priest of the old kind, a man who could stand up before his congregation and speak, who kept a small library, who valued memory and language and argument, who could recite and quote and turn a phrase. Nikola would remember, later in life, how his father would set him little mental exercises, how the household ran on words and thinking, and the disciplined turning of the mind. That was one half of where he came from, the father, the church, the books, the words. But it is the other half, the mother, who is really the more remarkable figure. And I want to slow right down here and give her the room she deserves, because so often in these old stories the mother is a shadow, and this one should not be. Her name was Uka, in some tellings Georgina Ukamandi, and she could not read. She had never been to school, never been taught her letters, in the way that so many women of that time and place were simply never given the chance. And yet she had, by every account, an absolutely extraordinary mind. a prodigious memory. She could hold long epic poems in her head, hundreds and hundreds of lines, and recite them from beginning to end without a single word written down anywhere, carrying whole works of poetry entirely inside her own memory, the way you or I might carry a single short song. And she did not only remember, she made things. She built, with her own hands, the tools and small machines that a busy farmhouse needed. She devised household implements, gadgets, to make the endless work of a rural home a little easier. A woman who had never been taught to read, inventing and building and improving quietly in a stone house in a small village, all while running a household and raising children. Tesla himself, when he wrote about his life much later, gave his mother enormous credit. He believed, and said so plainly, that whatever gift he had for invention came down to him from her. Not from the educated father with his books and sermons, but from the unschooled mother with her flawless memory and her clever hands. The mind that could hold an entire poem without a page, the hands that could build a tool without a plan. If you are looking for the true source of the storm child, it is not the lightning outside the window, it is her, inside the house. Hold that picture for a moment, because it is a warm one, and I want you to rest in it. A dark evening in a frontier village. A fire. A mother who cannot read a single word, reciting a long, long poem from memory to her children, the lines rolling out of her one after another, perfect, as the light flickers. And among those children, a small, watchful boy, taking it all in, learning, without quite knowing it, that a human mind can hold impossibly large things whole, complete, without ever writing them down. That lesson would matter more than almost anything else he ever learned. But we will come to that. There were other children in that house. Tesla was not the only one, and the family was not a simple, untroubled one, because whose family ever is? There was an older brother, his name was Dane, and Dane was by all accounts the golden child of the family, brilliant, promising, the one on whom the parents' hopes seemed most brightly to rest. The eldest son, the one who would carry the family forward. And when Nikola was still very young, only about 5 years old, Dane died. It was an accident. A fall from a horse. One of those sudden, ordinary, unbearable losses that fall on families out of a clear sky, that take the brightest one and leave the house changed forever. And the grief of it, Tesla wrote much later, shadowed his entire childhood. It hung over the household like weather that would not clear. And here is the part that aches, the part that I think anyone who has ever felt themselves the second best child in a grieving family will recognize in their bones. Tesla felt, all through his growing up, that nothing he ever did could satisfy his parents the way Dane's mere promise had. He would achieve something, do something clever, show some spark of the gift that was so plainly in him, and it would land in a house that was still mourning a brighter boy who was gone. The achievements never seemed to fill the space. The praise never seemed to reach him the way it might have if Dane had lived. He grew up in the shadow of a dead brother he could never catch, competing with a memory, and a memory always wins, because a memory never grows up, and never disappoints, and never falls short. It only shines. I want you to sit gently with that, not sadly, but gently, because I think it is one of the keys to everything that comes after. This is a story about a man who all his life worked as though he could never do quite enough, who pushed and pushed and pushed, past ordinary limits, past what a body should be asked to give, who claimed he did not even sleep, who could not seem to rest, And somewhere near the root of all that driving, ceaseless effort is a small boy in a stone house, trying and trying and trying to earn a place in the light beside a brother he had lost before he was old enough to really know him. You do not have to make too much of it. The mind is a complicated country, and no single loss explains a whole person. But keep it. It is a thread. It runs a long way. And now let me tell you about the flashes of light, because this is where the young Nikola begins to become strange, in the particular way that he would be strange for the rest of his life, and it is a strangeness that is genuinely astonishing, and, told softly, rather beautiful. From very early childhood, Tesla experienced something that he could not turn off and did not understand, and would spend years learning simply to live with. He saw flashes of light, blinding flashes, bright and sudden, that appeared before his eyes with no cause in the outside world. And along with them, and sometimes instead of them, he saw visions. Vivid, involuntary images, pictures that rose up in front of him with such force and such clarity that they seemed as real as the room he was standing in. He might hear a single word, just one word spoken aloud, and that word alone could trigger an entire vision, a whole scene unfurling before his eyes, uninvited, uncontrollable, so real that he sometimes could not immediately tell whether the thing he was seeing was in front of him or only inside his own head. Try for a moment to imagine what that must have been like for a small boy who did not yet have any words for it. To be sitting quietly, and to have the world suddenly flare with light that no one else can see. To hear a word and be flooded with images so strong they blot out the actual room. To not be able to make them stop. He described these experiences himself, many years later, in his own memoir, so we are hearing this in his own voice, which means we should hold it as his own account of himself, rather than as something outside observers measured, but it is genuinely revealing. And he clearly found it real, and clearly found it difficult. He wrote that these flashes and visions troubled him, that they came without warning, and that a great part of his early effort as a young person was learning to master them, learning to control what appeared before his eyes, learning to push the unwanted images down and to hold the bright, disorienting flashes at bay. It was, for him, a discipline, something he had to work at, a taming of his own overactive inner sight. And here is the turn, the thing that makes this not just a story of a boy troubled by strange perceptions, but the story of how one of the most unusual minds of the modern age was formed. Because that same faculty, that same overwhelming inner vision that plagued him as a child, was the very thing that would become his greatest tool as an inventor. He learned, over years, not only to control the visions, but to use them. He developed, and later described in detail, an ability that sounds almost impossible when you first hear it. He could build a machine entirely in his mind. Not sketch it, not model it, build it, complete, in his imagination, every part of it, and then run it there, inside his own head, watch it turn, watch it work, and even, he claimed, let it run for a while, and then inspect it for wear, for the places where the parts would rub and weaken over time. All without ever laying a hand on a single piece of metal, without ever building a physical prototype at all. Think of what that means. Most inventors, most engineers, most of us, when we try to design something, we sketch, we build a rough version, we test it, it breaks or it sticks or it wobbles, we learn from the failure, we build another. It is slow, and it is physical, and it happens out in the world where we can see it. Tesla claimed he could do all of that inside his mind, run the whole process of trial and error in imagination, at the speed of thought, and only build the thing in the real world once it was already, in his head, perfect. Whether it worked quite as flawlessly as he described, we cannot know, because we cannot climb inside a dead man's memory of his own mind. But that he possessed some extraordinary power of mental visualization is not really in doubt. It runs all through his work, and it runs straight back to those uncontrollable childhood visions, and it runs, if you follow it further still, all the way back to a mother who could hold an entire epic poem whole and perfect inside a head that had never been taught to read. Do you see how the pieces begin to fit? Not into a neat machine, because people are not machines, but into a shape, a family resemblance across a life. The mother who held whole poems in her mind. The boy who saw whole visions he could not stop. The man who would build whole machines in his imagination and only afterward pull them out into the world of copper and steel. It is one thread, drawn very long. And running right alongside it, from the very start, is that other quality, the intensity, the refusal of ordinary limits, the sense that a normal amount of effort, a normal amount of rest, a normal way of being a person, was simply not enough. The boy in the shadow of the golden brother. The mind that never stopped generating light and images even when its owner wanted quiet. Is it any wonder, really, that such a person would grow up to say that he barely slept, that he would come to believe, or at least to claim, that he could work through the night, night after night, on 2 hours of sleep, because his mind was always running anyway, always turning, always throwing up light in the dark? But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and I promised you we would take this slowly, so let me pull us gently back to the pace of a village, to the pace of a childhood, to the pace of your own slow breathing right now. Because before Nikola Tesla was any of the things the world would later make him into, before he was the rival of Edison, before he was the man who lit Niagara, before he was the strange old figure in the hotel room feeding his pigeons, he was simply a boy in Smiljan, and then a boy in the small towns nearby as his father's work moved the family about, growing up in that green and hilly frontier country, walking to school, watching his mother work, mourning his brother, seeing his flashes of light, and being told, gently and firmly, that he was meant for the church. That was the plan, you understand. His father wanted him to become a priest, to follow Milutin into the Orthodox clergy, to take up the family calling, the sermons and the books, and the quiet, respected life of a man of the church in a small community. And you can imagine the weight of that, on a boy who had already grown up, feeling he could never quite satisfy his parents, whose brighter brother was gone. Here was a way, perhaps, to finally please his father, to become what his father wanted. And here, at the same time, was a mind on fire with visions of machines, a mind that lit up not at scripture, but at the turning of wheels and the flow of unseen forces. A mind that wanted, more than anything, to build, the pull of the father's wish against the pull of the boy's own nature. That tension, too, is part of the story, and we will see how it resolves, though not tonight, or at least not for a good while yet, because there is no need to rush it. For now, simply hold the boy. Smiljan, the stone houses, the dark, star-filled nights of the military frontier, a priest father who wants a priest son, an unschooled mother who can build a machine with her hands and recite a poem 1,000 lines long from memory, a dead brother whose light the living boy can never quite step into, and the boy himself, tall for his age and getting taller, thin, watchful, seeing flashes no one else can see, learning slowly, painfully, to master the strange bright country inside his own skull. That is where he starts. That is the raw material. And out of it, over the decades to come, will be drawn one of the most consequential and most peculiar lives of the entire electrical age. A life that would give the modern world one of its deepest foundations and would end, all the same, in a rented room with the bills unpaid. And through all of it, from the flashes in childhood to the very last quiet years, there is that question I hung over the whole night at the start, still burning in its far window. The sleep. 2 hours a night, he would say. 2 hours, and the rest given over to work. We have not forgotten it. We are only letting it wait, the way it deserves to wait, until we have walked far enough into his life to understand where such a claim could possibly come from, and why the people who loved him and worked beside him would quietly tell a different story. Because that is the real heart of what we are doing here tonight. Not to catch a great man in a lie. There is no pleasure in that, and it is not even true to call it a lie. But to understand how the very same fire, the very same relentless, limit-refusing, endlessly running intensity that let a boy build machines inside his own mind and grow into the man who electrified the world, is also, in all likelihood, the fire that produced the story of a man who did not sleep. The counting, the pushing, the all-or-nothing reckoning of himself. It is one personality, in the laboratory and in the legend. The same person. We will see it come clear, gently, in its own time. So let your shoulders drop a little, if they have not already. Let the village grow quiet in your mind, the fire dying down, the poem finished, the children asleep, even the boy who sees flashes of light finally, for a few hours, seeing nothing at all but the dark behind his own closed eyes. Whatever he would later say about 2 hours a night, he was, once, a sleeping child in a house in Smiljan, and the night held him the way it is holding you now. We have a long road ahead of us, all the way to New York, all the way to the falls at Niagara, all the way to a tower on Long Island, and a room high in a hotel, and a white bird at the window. But there is no need to hurry toward any of it. The story will keep. The night will keep. And we will walk it together, slowly, one gentle step at a time. There is a particular kind of learning that does not happen in a classroom, and Tesla knew it early. He knew it before he had words for it, before he understood what it made him, or what it would cost him, or what it would one day produce. He knew it the way a child knows that a certain room in the house is colder than the others, not because anyone has explained the architecture to him, but because his body has simply registered the fact and filed it without ceremony, the way bodies do. And what Tesla had registered, somewhere in those early years in Smiljan, was that the inside of his own mind was a place where things could be built, not imagined in the loose, vague way that most of us imagine things, not the blurred sketch that most people carry around when they try to picture something not in front of them. Built, precisely, with dimensions that held, with tolerances that could be checked, with moving parts that moved according to the actual laws of how moving parts behave. He could set a mechanism going in his mind and watch it run, and notice where the wear was beginning to show, and adjust, and watch again. The prototype existed entirely inside his skull, and it was not a metaphor. It was, or he believed it to be, a real working model, made of nothing but attention and time and the strange electrical weather of a brain that had been producing involuntary light shows since childhood. He wrote about this later in the short memoir he called My Inventions. Published in 1919, when he was already in his early 60s and the arc of his great career was, in most practical respects, already behind him. He wrote about it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man describing a tool he has used for decades, a familiar implement whose properties he no longer finds remarkable because he has never known a time without it. He said that he had no need to build physical models. He said that before anything was made in the material world, he had already made it in his mind, run it through its paces, measured the results, and known what it would do. And that when the physical version was eventually built, it matched. The proportions were right. The behavior was what he had predicted. There was, he said, no discrepancy. Now, you should know that this is a thing he said about himself, and that we are in the territory of self-report, which is the territory of the particular and the personal and the not always straightforwardly verifiable. We are not in the territory of laboratory measurement. The gift Tesla described is real in the sense that some people do possess extraordinary powers of spatial visualization. And the history of invention and mathematics and engineering is full of individuals who seem to work out complex three-dimensional problems in their heads with a fluency that others find difficult to credit. That is documented. That is accepted. But the specific claim that Tesla's mental models were perfectly accurate, that the discrepancy between imagination and reality was zero, is his own account of his own abilities. We take it as testimony, valuable and illuminating testimony about how he understood himself and his process, and we hold it with the gentle awareness that all autobiography is also, in some part, self-creation. The man who later claimed to sleep 2 hours a night and meant every word of it was the same man who said his mental prototypes were perfect. The intensity is consistent. The self-mythology is consistent. What is not in question is the direction the gift drove him. It drove him toward physics, toward the behavior of forces and fields and current, toward the questions underneath the visible world. And so, after the village, after Smiljan, after the years in which he was the boy who could not replace his brother Dane, and who saw light that no one else saw, he went to school. The serious school, the institutional school, the school with instruments and textbooks and professors who had studied these things in the formal way. He went to the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz. This was in Styria, in what is now Austria. A proper technical institution in a proper 19th century European city with stone buildings and lecture halls and a culture of engineering that took itself seriously, as such places did. He arrived as a young man who had already been living inside the questions that the school proposed to answer. And by most accounts, including his own, he was formidable. He worked intensely, the way he had always worked, which is to say, without apparent regard for the ordinary rhythms of work and rest that governed the lives of the people around him. He attended lectures. He mastered the material. He pushed further than the coursework required, because the coursework was never, for him, the point. The point was the thing underneath the coursework, the principle, the mechanism, the why. He did not complete his degree. This is a fact that biographers note, and that is sometimes made to carry a heavy symbolic load in the telling of his life, as though the incomplete degree is evidence of some collision between his genius and the limitations of formal education. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it is also simply true that he ran out of money, and that his father and the school were in some degree of conflict about his path, and that the circumstances of a young man's life do not always arrange themselves tidily around the requirements of institutional completion. He left Graz without finishing. He spent time in Prague. He continued to think about the things he had been thinking about in Graz, and before Graz, and before that in the village. The problems of electromagnetic induction, the behavior of electrical current, the ways in which a magnetic field could be made to rotate, and what a rotating magnetic field might be able to do. There is a particular problem in electrical engineering, one that the late 19th century was pressing hard against, and it is worth spending a moment with it, because everything that follows, everything from the lights at Niagara Falls to the tower on Long Island to the final state of a man's finances in a hotel room, flows from the way that problem was eventually solved. Or more precisely, from the way that Tesla, on a walk in a park in Budapest, believed he had solved it. In 1882, in the dirt, with a stick, while reciting lines from a German poem about a man who sold his soul. The problem is this: electricity, to be useful, must travel. It must travel from where it is generated to where it is needed, and in the 1870s and early 1880s, the dominant system for generating and transmitting electrical power was direct current. Direct current moves in one direction. Think of water flowing steadily down a pipe in a single, uninterrupted stream, always in the same direction, always at the same pressure. That is direct current. And Thomas Edison, who was by the early 1880s already a famous and powerful figure in American industry, had built his electrical empire around it. His Pearl Street station in New York, opened in 1882, was a direct current generating plant, and it powered the lights in the buildings around it through direct current lines laid under the streets. But direct current has a problem. A stubborn, fundamental, physics-based problem that no amount of engineering ingenuity can fully overcome, because it is not an engineering failure, but a physical fact. When you send direct current over a wire, it loses energy. It loses energy to the resistance of the wire itself, and the amount of energy it loses increases with the distance it has to travel. This is not a flaw in the design, it is a property of the universe. And the consequence is that a direct current generating station can only serve the buildings near it. To serve a city, you need many stations, placed throughout the city, close enough to their customers that the current has not bled away too much of its energy by the time it arrives. Edison's system required this. It was, by its nature, local. The solution, in principle, was known. You could step voltage up to a very high level for transmission, high voltage, low current, which means much less energy lost to resistance over long distances, and then step it back down at the destination to a safe and usable level. This stepping up and stepping down can be accomplished with a device called a transformer. And transformers work with alternating current, which reverses direction many times per second in a rapid regular oscillation, like the surface of water being vibrated rather than made to flow in a single direction. But here is where the difficulty lay. In 1882, the motors and generators of the day were designed for direct current. Alternating current was understood as a phenomenon, but harnessing it, building a motor that would run on it efficiently, that would not waste the power in its reversals, that would take the oscillation and turn it into smooth mechanical rotation, this was the problem. This was, in essence, the engineering wall that Tesla spent his early career running at. And then came the walk in Budapest. He described it later as one of those moments that arrives whole, without warning, the answer presenting itself to the prepared mind, the way a door opens that was always there but invisible. He was in the city of Budapest in 1882, in a park. He was walking in the evening light, and he was reciting, from memory, lines from Goethe's Faust. the great German poem of a man of extraordinary intellectual ambition who makes a bargain with darkness in pursuit of knowledge. Because Tesla knew the poem, had absorbed it, and carried it around in his head the way his mother Uka had carried long Serbian epic poems in hers, as a living structure of language that the mind could travel through. He was in that particular state of relaxed movement, of words flowing, of the body occupied with the simple act of walking through a garden in fading light, when the solution arrived. He saw it. Not metaphorically, not as a gradual intellectual clarification. He saw it in the air in front of him, the way he had always seen his inventions, fully formed, precise, with its dimensions fixed and its principles clear. The rotating magnetic field. The understanding that if you ran two or more alternating currents, slightly offset from each other in their timing, through the windings of a motor, the resulting magnetic fields would interact in a way that produced smooth, continuous rotation. A motor that would turn not despite the alternating nature of the current, but because of it. No commutator, the complicated mechanical device that Edison's DC motors needed to keep the current flowing in the right direction. No sparking. No friction at the place where the current was switched. Just rotation, induced by fields, clean and continuous and efficient. He knelt down, or so the account goes, and drew the design in the dirt of the park path with a stick. His walking companion witnessed it. The diagram was there in the earth for a moment, and then they moved on, and the earth remained where earth always remains, and the design was already gone from the ground and entirely inside his head, where nothing was going to move it or blur it or cause it to be forgotten. He said afterward that the vision was so complete, so exact, that he could have built the motor from it immediately, without further thought, without revision, without the need for any refinement at all. This is the account he gave. It is his account. And it has, in the telling and retelling, acquired a certain quality of mythology, the lone genius in the park with the poem and the stick, the sudden illumination, the world changed in an instant. We should hold it as we hold the rest of his self-report, as genuine testimony to how he understood his own mind, told by a man who genuinely believed it, and who, in all the broad strokes of the physics and the motor design, was correct. The rotating magnetic field was real. The polyphase ACK induction motor that followed from it was real. The capacity of that system to transmit power over long distances was real. Whether the vision arrived in precisely that form, at precisely that moment, in precisely that Budapest Park is a question that the dirt of the path could not answer, and the passing years certainly cannot, and it does not, in the end, matter very much. The idea was his. The physics was right. And the evening light over a Budapest park in 1882 is as good a place as any to mark the moment. Because the world does need to mark it somewhere, and Tesla himself chose to mark it there. He was not yet in a position to build it. He was 25 or 26 years old in Budapest without a laboratory or significant resources, and the world had not yet arranged itself in a way that made the exploitation of the polyphase ACK motor a straightforward next step. He needed to move. And the move he made next was west, to France, and to the company of Thomas Edison's European operations. The Continental Edison Company in Paris was, in the early 1880s, one of the nodes in the expanding network of Edison's electrical enterprises. It was the place where engineers with the appropriate knowledge and skills were put to work on the practical installation and maintenance of Edison's direct current systems across Europe. It was a company built on the DC paradigm run on the DC paradigm, committed in every practical and financial sense to the DC paradigm. And into this company, in 1882 or thereabouts, arrived a young Serbian engineer carrying in his head an idea that was, if it worked the way he believed it did, the beginning of the end of that paradigm. He did not announce this. He went to work. He was a good engineer, careful and industrious and quick, and the people who supervised him found him able and useful. And he was given increasing responsibility, and he performed it well. He was not yet trying to revolutionize electrical transmission. He was doing his job. But he was also, in whatever time he had, continuing to think about the rotating magnetic field and the motor and the system that might one day make long-distance AC power practical at scale. And then he met Charles Batchelor. Or rather, he came to the sustained attention of Charles Batchelor, who was one of Edison's closest and most trusted associates, a man who had worked with Edison since the Menlo Park days and who understood both the technical and the personal dimensions of Edison's world with an intimacy that most people never achieved. Batchelor saw what Tesla could do, and he formed a clear enough opinion of the young engineer's abilities that he encouraged Tesla, or perhaps arranged for Tesla, to take the next step, which was the step across the ocean, to America, to Edison himself. There is a letter of introduction attributed to Batchelor, which Tesla carried with him to New York. And on this letter, or so the story goes, was written a sentence that has become one of the most quoted lines in the lore of American invention. "I know two great men," the sentence supposedly said, "and you are one of them, and this young man is the other." It is a marvelous sentence. It is the kind of sentence that belongs in the story of a marvelous life. And it is, in the cold light of historical scrutiny, a thing that is very difficult to verify. It may have been said, it may have been written, it may have existed in exactly the form in which it is always quoted. And it may also be the case that memory over time and admiration over time, and the desire for a story to have exactly the shape that a great story should have smoothed and burnished and perhaps simplified whatever the actual letter said into something crisper and more perfect than the original. We hold it lightly. We do not dismiss it. We simply know that the letter, whatever it said, was enough. Tesla arrived at Edison's office in New York in 1884, and he was received. He arrived in New York in June of that year, which is to say he arrived in the heat of a New York summer, in a city that was already, by 1884, an extraordinary and overwhelming place, teeming and noisy and crowded and full of the smell and sound of a metropolis that had been growing with an urgency that was almost organic, driven by immigration and industry and the particular American conviction that the future was not something to be waited for, but something to be built right now, by hand with available materials, without pause for reflection or hesitation. He arrived from a Europe that was, in its way, more formal and measured in its pace, and New York must have struck him as something close to a physical force. A weather system, an environment that demanded an immediate response and gave you very little time to compose it. He had almost nothing. His luggage had been stolen or lost somewhere between Europe and the docks, and he arrived with the clothes he was wearing and a notebook and the letter and the things inside his own head, which were, as always, the most substantial possessions he owned, and the only ones that would remain with him through everything that followed. He made his way to Edison's office, and he presented himself and the letter, and he was given a place in the organization at Edison Machine Works. Edison Machine Works was a large and busy operation, and Edison himself was by this point already a figure of enormous reputation. The inventor of the phonograph and the electric light, and many other things, a man who had systematized invention itself, who had created at Menlo Park and then at West Orange something that was, in its structure and intent, a kind of invention factory. Teams of men working on problems in parallel, Edison moving among them, directing and questioning, and occasionally descending into the work himself with the kind of sustained intensity that everyone who witnessed it agreed was remarkable. He was not a figure of warmth, exactly. He was a figure of force, pragmatic, economically shrewd, operating always with one eye on the commercial applications of what his laboratories produced. And he slept very little, or so he always said. 4 hours, perhaps, or less, on the big nights. He was famous for it. He would sleep on a workbench, in a corner, in whatever surface was available, and then wake and go back to work. This was part of who he was, or at least part of who he presented himself to be. We will return to this. Tesla went to work at Edison Machine Works with the same quality of intensity he brought to everything, which meant that he worked very long hours and threw himself at difficult problems and was noticed. And at some point, the exact timing is disputed, and everything about this episode comes largely from Tesla's own later account. Something passed between them that Tesla would describe for the rest of his life as a defining moment of personal and professional injustice. Whether it happened precisely as he remembered it is something we cannot know with certainty, and it is important to say so clearly because the story has been told and retold and has accumulated in the telling. The quality of historical fact when it is better understood as historical testimony. Tesla said that Edison, pleased with his work, offered him a large sum of money, $50,000, in the account Tesla gave, to redesign and improve Edison's direct current dynamos, and that Tesla did this, and that the work was successful and the dynamos were improved. And that when he went to Edison for the money, Edison laughed and told him that he did not understand American humor, that the offer had been a joke, and that the $50,000 was not coming. This is Tesla's account. It is vivid, specific, and deeply felt. It is also disputed. Edison's people denied it or described it differently, or said the conversation had not happened in that form, or perhaps had not happened at all. And since we are now entirely in the domain of what one person said happened and what another person said about what happened, we cannot adjudicate the dispute. What we can say is that Tesla left Edison Machine Works not long after, that he left in a state of considerable disillusionment, and that whatever the precise cause, the working relationship between these two extraordinary men was over, and they would spend much of the following decade on opposite sides of one of the most consequential technical and commercial disputes in the history of electrical engineering. But before the dispute, the physics. Because the dispute, the famous War of the Currents, can only be understood if you understand the thing that made it inevitable. And the thing that made it inevitable was the fundamental difference between what Edison had built and what Tesla was proposing. Edison's system was direct current, one direction, steady, and the problem of the steady one-directional current is the problem of distance. Because a wire is not a frictionless channel. A wire has resistance, the way a river has friction against its banks and its bed. And when current moves through a wire with resistance, some of that current is lost to the resistance as heat. The wire warms slightly. The energy is dissipated. And the longer the wire, the more of the energy is lost before the current arrives at the other end. This is not a design flaw. This is the physics of electrical conduction. It was true in Edison's time, and it is true in ours, and there is nothing to be done about it except to work with it or around it. Edison's solution was to put his generating stations close to his customers. The Pearl Street station served Lower Manhattan. If you wanted power for your building in Lower Manhattan, Pearl Street could reach you. If your building was somewhere else, somewhere farther away, you needed another station, closer to you. The system was, by its physical nature, a city of islands, each generating station surrounded by the small territory it could reach before the current faded too far to be useful. To power a whole city comprehensively, you needed many stations. To power a whole country, the number of stations you would need was essentially incalculable. You were not going to transmit power from a waterfall in upstate New York to a city on the coast with direct current. The current would not arrive. With alternating current, the situation is different. Alternating current reverses direction many times per second in the modern standard. 60 times in North America, 50 in much of the rest of the world, back and forth, positive and negative, in a rapid regular cycle. And the crucial property of alternating current, the property that makes it the foundation of every electrical grid that has ever been built anywhere in the world, is that it can be transformed. You can take alternating current at 1 voltage and pass it through a transformer, 2 coils of wire wound around an iron core, and it emerges at a different voltage. You can step it up to very high voltages for transmission, and at very high voltage the current is proportionally very low, which means the energy lost to resistance in the transmission wire is very small. Which means you can send power over very long distances without losing most of it on the way. And then at the destination, you use another transformer to step the voltage back down to safe and usable levels, and the power arrives, and the lights come on. This is the whole game. This is the physics that underpins every electrical outlet in every building in the world today. The transformer works on alternating current. It does not work on direct current. And so, alternating current can be transmitted over long distances, and direct current, without something like a transformer to manage its energy losses, cannot. The implications of this for the design of an electrical grid are absolute. They are not a matter of opinion or engineering preference. They are a consequence of physics, and Tesla understood this, had understood it since the park in Budapest, had been sitting with the understanding for years by the time he left Edison Machine Works and began to look for a way to put the rotating magnetic field to practical use. The man who would give him that way was already in business a few blocks away, or at least in the same city, or at least in the same industrial world. His name was George Westinghouse, and he was a Pittsburgh businessman and inventor of considerable acumen, and he had been watching the development of alternating current systems with the kind of focused commercial attention that characterized everything he did. He had already been investing in technology. He understood the physics. And when he learned about Tesla's polyphase system, about the induction motor and the patents that had been filed and the lecture that was being planned, he recognized what he was looking at. But we are not quite there yet. First, there was the period between Edison Machine Works and Westinghouse, a period in which Tesla found himself, for a time, without laboratory or backing or the resources to pursue the work that he believed was the most important work of his life. He did what he could. He thought. He worked with what he had. And then, slowly, the connections were made, the investors were found, and the patents began to be written, and the lecture was arranged, and the extraordinary years that would carry him from a lab in Lower Manhattan to the lighting of a World's Fair were beginning to take their particular, irreversible shape. He was not sleeping 2 hours a night. Or at least, we cannot be sure that he was. What we can be sure of is that he was working with the kind of focused, driven, relentless attention that has always, in all people who possess it, a complicated and ambivalent relationship with sleep. The work pulls you forward. The idea is not finished. The solution is close. The body is a machine, and like all machines it needs maintenance, but the question of how much maintenance it actually requires, as opposed to how much it seems to demand, is one that certain kinds of minds press with an insistence that ordinary bodies do not share. Whether that pressing is ultimately wise, whether it is sustainable, whether the accounts that emerge from it accurately reflect the actual behavior, or the desired behavior, or the remembered behavior. These are the questions that this particular story is slowly, quietly, unhurriedly building toward. There is no rush. The night is long, and the alternating current that runs through the walls around you has its own long story, and it is only beginning to unfold. The lights outside, if there are any, are burning on his system. The current is alternating, as he understood it would need to do, reversing direction 60 times every second, invisible and reliable, and essentially unchanged in its principles from what he drew in the mud of a Budapest park more than 140 years ago. It is a strange thought to carry into sleep, a strange comfort, that the thing which lights the room, or the street outside the window, or the display of whatever device is playing this voice into your ear, is running on the insight of a young man reciting Goethe to himself in a fading European evening and kneeling to scratch the answer into the earth. He did not know, in that moment, what it would cost him. He did not know about Morgan or Marconi, or the tower that would stand half-built on Long Island and then be torn down. He only knew the field, rotating, clean, and the motor turning, and the long distance that the current could now, in principle, travel, the distance between a generating station and the world. The distance between an idea drawn in dirt and a civilization lit from within. He filed the patents in 1887. There were several of them, covering the polyphase system from multiple angles, the induction motor, the transformer, the method of transmitting power in alternating waves that could be stepped up in voltage for the long journey and stepped back down again at the other end, arriving at a lamp or a machine or a factory floor still carrying enough force to be useful. He had worked through the principles at his own laboratory by then, a workspace he had managed to secure after the months of wandering that followed his departure from Edison Machine Works. Months during which he had, by some accounts, dug ditches for a living, which seems almost too neat a detail for a legend, the man who would light the continent reduced to turning over Earth with a shovel. And yet there it is. The patents were filed. The applications were precise. The American patent system, whatever its slowness, eventually acknowledged what was in front of it. And then, in the spring of 1888, he stood before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers and explained it. The lecture was not a performance in the theatrical sense. He was not a natural showman by every account. He was precise, controlled, formal in the way that a person whose inner life runs very fast sometimes learns to be formal on the outside, a kind of steady container for what would otherwise be unmanageable. The audience was the relevant audience, the engineers and scientists and technically educated men who understood what they were being shown. And what they were being shown was the complete polyphase alternating current system, demonstrated with working models, explained from first principles, its advantages made clear not through rhetoric, but through the apparatus itself, turning and humming on the table in front of them. He was 31 years old. The system that now runs through the walls of virtually every building in the developed world had been publicly presented, in working form, by a 31-year-old Serbian engineer who had arrived in New York 4 years earlier with 4 cents in his pocket and a letter of introduction. George Westinghouse sent a representative, or came himself, depending on which version of the account you trust. Either way, Westinghouse heard about the lecture, or attended it, and understood immediately what the polyphase system meant for his company and for the contest that was already beginning to define the American electrical industry. Westinghouse was a manufacturer and an industrialist, a man who had already built his fortune on the railway air brake, and who understood the relationship between a sound patent and a profitable business. He approached Tesla. They reached an agreement. The precise financial terms shifted over the years as the business landscape changed. There were royalties involved at first, and later, under circumstances that tell their own quiet story about Tesla's relationship with money and with obligation. Those royalties were renegotiated in ways that left Tesla with less than the agreement originally specified. He agreed to the renegotiation. He said he wanted the system to succeed more than he wanted the money, and perhaps that was true. And perhaps it was also true that the system did succeed, and that the money still found other places to go. But in 1888, the agreement was made, the patents passed under Westinghouse's licensing, and the war, as they called it later, began in earnest. War of the Currents. The name came afterward, attached by people who wanted to give the episode a shape, and it is not entirely wrong. There was a genuine technical dispute at its centre, the question of which electrical system should be adopted at scale as the American grid expanded outward from the coastal cities into the continent, and superimposed on the technical dispute was something that looked more like a campaign, a deliberate effort to shape public perception, and the man doing much of the shaping was Edison. Edison did not like alternating current. He had built his empire on direct current, and he understood the physics well enough to know that his system and Tesla's system were not really in competition on neutral terms. The physics favored AC for long-distance transmission in ways that DC simply could not match, and the distance problem was the whole problem. Because the cities of the United States were not compact little islands where a generating station could sit at the center and send current a few blocks in every direction. They were sprawling and growing, and the mines and the waterfalls and the other sources of large-scale power were often miles away, and miles killed direct current in a way that alternating current could survive. Edison knew this, and perhaps knowing it sharpened his response. The way that knowing you are losing an argument on the merits sometimes pushes a person toward arguments that are not about the merits. The campaign he ran against alternating current was built on danger. And alternating current was dangerous. This part was not invented. The voltages required to transmit AC over distance were genuinely lethal in a way that the lower voltages of the DC distribution system were not. And accidents happened, and people were killed by live wires in the early years of the electrical industry in ways that were terrible and real. Edison's camp used these accidents. They distributed pamphlets. They arranged public demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted with alternating current, including, in an episode that has become perhaps the most uncomfortable footnote in the whole story, a circus elephant named Topsy. Though that particular event came years later and is somewhat separate from the War of the Currents proper. The demonstrations were meant to show what the current did to living tissue, and they did show it, graphically, and the newspapers reported on them. And then there was the electric chair. The state of New York had been searching for a more humane method of execution than hanging, and a dentist named Alfred Southwick had proposed electrical execution as a painless alternative. The committee convened to study the question consulted Edison, who had made his position on capital punishment publicly clear. He opposed it, but who nonetheless recommended alternating current as the method to use, on the grounds that it would be most efficient. The reasoning, if it was reasoning, had a certain terrible elegance. Recommend for execution the current belonging to your competitor. Attach the association of death to the technology you are fighting, and let the newspapers and the public imagination do the rest. The first electric chair was built to run on a Westinghouse ACK generator. The word that Edison's camp reportedly wanted attached to the act of execution by electricity was not electrocution, but something derived from Westinghouse's name. A verb they tried to introduce into usage. It did not stick. Westinghouse fought to keep his generators away from the process. He lost. The chair was used for the first time on 6 August 1890 at Auburn Prison in New York. Tesla understood what was happening. He had seen enough of the campaign to understand its nature, and he gave demonstrations of his own. Passing high-frequency, alternating current through his own body to light lamps without visible wires, standing in his laboratory as currents ran across his skin in what looked like pale fire, unhurt, the physics of high frequency making the difference. It was theatre, and it was genuine. The safety of high-frequency ACK at certain voltages is real. And he was demonstrating it with his own body as the proof. But theatre matters, and his demonstrations mattered, and the public was watching both sides. What settled it, in the end, was not theatre, but contracts. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago in 1893. It was an enormous thing, a city of white plaster buildings constructed on the lakefront to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, a fair of a scale and ambition that the United States had not previously attempted, attended by more than 27 million people over 6 months. A number that requires a moment to sit with. 27 million. In 1893. The population of the entire United States at that time was somewhere around 63 million people, which means that a very large fraction of the country made its way to the lakefront in Chicago and walked through a city made of light. And the light was alternating current. Westinghouse had bid for the contract to illuminate the exposition and won it, undercutting Edison's General Electric by a margin that reflected, among other things, the inherent efficiency advantage of the ACK system. 100,000 incandescent lamps burned on the Tesla Westinghouse system across the grounds of the fair, and when visitors stepped inside and looked around them at the electric night, they were standing inside the argument that had been running for years, and the argument had already been won. There was a more durable monument, though, quieter and less visible and more lasting than any fair. Niagara Falls had been studied for years as a potential source of large-scale electrical power. The volume of water moving over the falls and through the gorge was staggering, and everyone who looked at it had understood for a long time that this was energy, that the falling water was doing work. and that if that work could be captured and converted and sent somewhere useful, it would be an almost inexhaustible source. The question was how to send it. A generating station at the falls could convert the water's energy into electricity, but the cities that needed the electricity, Buffalo, and eventually further beyond, were miles away, and miles, as we have established, were the problem that only alternating current could solve. The contract for the Niagara power plant was awarded in 1893, the same year as the Chicago Exposition. And the generating station that was built there, the Adams Power Plant, named for its financier Edward Dean Adams, used Tesla's polyphase system. The turbines turned, the generators produced alternating current, the transformers stepped the voltage up for the long journey. And on a night in November 1896, electrical power from Niagara Falls reached the city of Buffalo, 26 miles away, and the lights of Buffalo came on. This is the real monument, not the artificial lightning at Colorado Springs, not the tower on Long Island, not the rumors and the legends and the claims about sleeping 2 hours a night. The Adams Power Plant at Niagara Falls, sending current through 26 miles of wire to light a city, is the thing that actually changed how human beings lived. The argument was over. The continent would be wired on alternating current, and the man who had drawn the rotating field in the dirt of a Budapest park 14 years earlier had won it, and the winning of it was quiet and permanent and invisible in the way that the most important things often are. Invisible because the infrastructure that carries it disappears into the walls, into the landscape, into the ordinary fact of a world that has electricity in it and does not much think about where the electricity comes from or what it costs to establish the principle. He had become an American citizen in 1891. The paperwork was filed, the oath was taken. The country that had received him with 4 cents in his pocket and a disputed letter of recommendation had acknowledged him formally as one of its own. He had also, around the same time, invented what became known as the Tesla coil, a resonant transformer circuit capable of producing very high voltages at high frequencies. The kind of voltages and frequencies that could make current jump through the air, that could light tubes of gas without touching them, that could produce the crackling arcs and the visible electricity that became the signature visual of his later public demonstrations. The Tesla coil is still manufactured, still used, still capable of producing the same pale arcs and the same crackling sound that his audiences in the early 1890s found astonishing and slightly frightening. And then, in March of 1895, the laboratory on South Fifth Avenue burned. He was not there when it started. The fire began in the basement, in one of the floors below his rented space, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, the flames had reached his laboratory and everything in it. Years of notes, prototypes, records of experiments that existed nowhere else, that had not been published or copied or transferred, that lived only in the physical materials on those shelves and in those cabinets. The fire took all of it. He arrived to find the building gutted and stood there in the street and said nothing, or very little, or what he said was not recorded in any account that has survived. The newspapers noted his losses with some sympathy. He was, by 1895, sufficiently well known that his misfortune was news. He rebuilt, eventually, in a new space. But notes are not rebuilt. The experiments that were not recorded are not recovered. Whatever was in those rooms that has not been reconstructed from memory or from subsequent repetition is simply gone. And the fire of March 1895 is one of the quiet subtractions in the story of what Nikola Tesla actually knew and what remains. He left New York in 1899, and went to Colorado. Colorado Springs was chosen for reasons that were partly practical and partly what you might call meteorological ambition. The altitude was significant, a mile above sea level. The air thinner and less conductive, which allowed for experiments with high voltages that would have been more dangerous at lower altitudes. The electrical storms of the Colorado summer were among the most powerful in the country, and he wanted to study them, to understand how lightning propagated through the earth and the atmosphere, and to test ideas about whether the earth itself could be used as a conductor for wireless transmission of electrical power. He secured land outside the town and built a laboratory there, a wooden structure with a roof that could be opened to allow for the discharge of very large electrical sparks into the open air, and in the center of the laboratory he built a magnifying transmitter, a version of the Tesla coil scaled up to a size that had not previously been attempted. John Jacob Astor IV provided some of the funding. Astor was at that point one of the wealthiest men in the United States, heir to the family fortune built on fur trading and New York real estate, a man who moved through the world with the particular ease that very old money produces. He was also, in his way, a person drawn to the speculative and the technical. He had written a science fiction novel. He had an interest in engineering. And Tesla's proposals, which combined genuine science with a kind of visionary largeness that appealed to a certain kind of wealthy imagination, attracted his support. The check was written. The laboratory was built. The experiments began. What happened at Colorado Springs in the summer and fall of 1899 is documented in Tesla's own laboratory notes, a record of measurements and observations and conclusions that he kept in some detail, and the notes describe things that were real and things that were, at the time and since, somewhat harder to categorize. The real things first. The magnifying transmitter produced electrical discharges of a scale that had genuinely not been seen before in a laboratory setting. The voltages involved were described in various accounts as reaching into the millions. Precise measurement at those scales was not straightforward, and the figures that appear in different sources differ, but the arcs that leaped from the apparatus to the ground and to the air around the laboratory were, by any account, enormous. They were tens of feet long. The crackling of them was audible from a considerable distance. They set the air alight with ozone, and they made the instruments in the laboratory behave in ways that required interpretation. On at least one occasion, the experiment tripped the generating equipment supplying power to the city of Colorado Springs and left the town without electricity for a period, which the operators of the generating station did not receive calmly. He stood inside that. He stood in the laboratory while arcs of artificial lightning, tens of feet long, crashed around him and took measurements and made notes. It is worth pausing over that image for a moment, not to inflate it into legend, but simply to see it clearly. A man in his early 40s, alone in a wooden building on the Colorado High Plain in the summer thunderstorm season, producing electrical discharges on a scale that the surrounding landscape did not normally generate except during genuine storms, and standing in the middle of it with a notebook, writing things down. And then there were the signals. Tesla's laboratory notes from Colorado Springs include an entry in which he described receiving, through the sensitive equipment he had built to detect electrical disturbances, a series of rhythmic signals that did not match the pattern of atmospheric static or of the electrical storms he was studying. The signals were regular. They repeated. They had a quality that he described, in his account written afterward, as ordered, as distinct from the noise of natural electrical phenomena. He speculated, And it is worth being precise about this word. He speculated, he did not claim, that the signals might originate from another planet. Mars was the candidate he named. The popular imagination of the late 19th century had been shaped by Camille Flammarion's writings on Martian civilization and by the reports of Percival Lowell's observations of the Martian canals. And the idea that Mars might be inhabited and might be attempting communication was not, in that particular cultural moment, quite as far outside the range of sober consideration as it would later become. Tesla was a man of his time in this, as in other things. The signals were not from Mars, that much can be said clearly, and Tesla, who was many things, was also a person capable of following evidence, and he seems to have understood over time that the interpretation was speculative and that other explanations were more likely. The signals themselves, whatever they were, atmospheric phenomena, the planet Jupiter's radio emissions which were not understood at the time, some terrestrial interference, were real enough that the instruments recorded them, and the recording of them is part of the historical record, and the speculation that arose from the recording is also part of the historical record, labelled clearly as what it was, the speculation of a brilliant man working at the edge of what could be known, in a laboratory on a high plane surrounded by his own artificial lightning, trying to listen to the Earth. He stayed in Colorado Springs through the winter of 1899 and into 1900. He gathered data. He wrote his notes. He had come with questions about wireless transmission and about whether the Earth itself could serve as a medium for sending power without wires across distances that made conventional transmission impractical. And the experiments convinced him that the answer was yes, that the principle was sound, that a transmitter of sufficient power could send energy through the globe, and that receivers anywhere on its surface could draw from it. Whether this was correct, in the form he imagined it, is a question that physics has answered with some care since then, and the answer is complicated. And some of what he believed was more nearly right than his critics allowed, and some of it was wrong in ways that mattered for the practical project he had in mind. But the experiments were real. The data was real. The conclusion he drew from them, that wireless power transmission at planetary scale was achievable, was the conclusion that drove him out of Colorado and back east, toward the thing that would consume the next years of his life, and would end in a silence that was different from the silence of the Colorado nights. The tower was already taking shape in his imagination before he left the high plane. He could see it in the way he had always seen his inventions, complete, detailed, already turning in his mind, the metal and wood and concrete of it, assembling themselves in the visual space behind his eyes, where the machines ran before they were built. It would be tall. It would be on the coast, where the geography and the proximity to the Atlantic would serve the purposes he had for it. It would transmit. Not just messages. Messages were what Marconi was building for. And the comparison between what Marconi was doing and what Tesla intended is part of the story, and the timing of what Marconi did and when he did it is part of the story. And all of that is coming. But for now, in 1900, in the last months before the new century's complications arrived to rewrite the terms of everything he was attempting, the tower existed in the only place it would ever exist in its complete form, inside the mind of the man who designed it, lit from within, transmitting. He had been awake, by some accounts, for very long stretches during the Colorado experiments. The kind of work he was doing, the monitoring of equipment through the night, the taking of readings at intervals, the adjustments and the recalibrations and the waiting for the conditions to be right, does not easily conform to regular sleep. He said later that he had worked through many nights without stopping, that the work demanded it, that the ideas came fastest in the dark when there were no other demands on his attention. And this is probably true in the way that many things about Tesla are probably true. Probably true and also probably not complete, not the whole picture, not an account that accounts for everything. Because the people who worked near him and the records of what they observed include naps. They include the long recovery sleeps that followed the marathon sessions, the hours or the days when the expenditure of the previous period was paid back in stillness. They include the qualifier he himself offered when pressed on the 2-hour claim that he only counted deep sleep as sleep, that the dozing and the resting and the brief surrenders to unconsciousness in a chair did not, in his accounting, constitute sleeping. It is a remarkable redefinition. It is a redefinition that keeps the number alive by changing what the number measures. He was, among all his other qualities, a man who understood the importance of precision, who understood that what you call a thing shapes what people believe about it, and the 2-hour claim is precise in its number and imprecise in its definition, and the imprecision is doing work that the precision cannot do alone. But all of that is the thread running beneath the story, the question planted at the beginning of this long night, the thing we are building toward. And we are not there yet. There is more of the life to walk through first. The tower on Long Island is still coming. The money and what happened to it is still coming. The pigeons in the park and the hotel room and the end of things are still coming. And the night is long enough for all of it. There is no need to rush. The alternating current is still running through the walls, 60 cycles every second. The field rotating in the generators at Niagara and at 1,000 other stations built in the decades since that first November night in 1896, when the lights of Buffalo came on and the argument was settled and the world began quietly to become what it now is. The Colorado High Plain is dark at this hour. The wooden laboratory is long gone, dismantled, the land returned to its original condition. There is no monument there. The artificial lightning he produced in that building left no permanent mark on the earth or the air. It was lightning, and lightning does not leave monuments. It only leaves the memory of the light and the sound, and the measurements written in a notebook, and the ideas that grew from the measurements and were carried east in the mind of the man who had stood inside it, unhurt, writing things down. Outside the Hotel New Yorker, the city that Edison and Tesla and Westinghouse between them helped to wire, is humming on current that neither of them would entirely recognize and both of them would entirely understand. The principles are the same. The rotating field, the transformer, the alternating wave that travels the distance and arrives still carrying its charge, these are unchanged. The scale has grown beyond anything they imagined, or beyond anything they could have been certain to imagine, though Tesla's imagination was not a small or cautious instrument, and he imagined many things that arrived later than he expected, or in forms slightly different from his vision, but arrived nonetheless. He imagined the tower. He imagined it standing on the shore of Long Island, 187 feet tall, its mushroom-shaped top aimed at the sky, transmitting energy wirelessly across the Atlantic and eventually, in his conception of it, across the planet. He imagined receivers at the other end drawing from the transmission, lights coming on in London or in Paris or wherever the receiver stood, powered by a source they could not see and a method they could not fully explain. He imagined a world differently wired than the world of copper cables and wooden poles that was being built around him, and he believed he could build it, and a man named Morgan wrote him a check. The man named Morgan was J.P. Morgan, and the check was for $150,000, which in 1901 was a sum that could build things, and Tesla intended to build something that had never existed. The site was at Shoreham, on the north shore of Long Island, and it was called Wardenclyffe, and what rose there over the following months was a tower 187 feet tall, with a 55-ton steel hemisphere at its top. A mushroom of copper-clad steel aimed at the sky, supported by a wooden shaft sunk deep into the ground and surrounded by a system of tunnels and iron pipes and electrodes buried beneath it, reaching down into the earth the way a tree's roots reach. Because Tesla believed, and believed with the particular certainty that had served him in Budapest and in Colorado Springs, that the earth itself was a conductor, and that the sky above it was a conductor, and that what he needed to do was bridge the gap between them at scale and let the energy move. What he had told Morgan he was building was a system for transmitting wireless communications across the Atlantic. This was true as far as it went. What he had not fully told Morgan, or had told him in terms that perhaps did not convey the full ambition of the vision, was that the tower at Wardenclyffe was meant to be only one node in a planetary system, that Tesla's actual goal was not to send messages but to send power, to distribute electrical energy through the Earth and the upper atmosphere to receiving stations anywhere on the globe, to make electricity as freely available as weather, drawn from the sky the way you draw water from a well, available to anyone with a receiver. It was, in scope and in strangeness, the largest thing he had ever imagined, and he had imagined the rotating magnetic field while reciting Goethe in a park, so the competition was significant. And then, in December of 1901, a young Italian inventor named Guglielmo Marconi stood in a station at Signal Hill in Newfoundland and pressed a telephone receiver to his ear and heard 3 dots, the Morse code letter S, transmitted from a station in Cornwall across more than 2,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean. 3 dots. It is hard to overstate what those 3 dots did to the tower at Wardenclyffe. Marconi had done what Tesla had promised Morgan he would do, and he had done it with equipment that cost a fraction of the $150,000 the mushroom-topped tower was consuming on the north shore of Long Island. Tesla insisted that Marconi was using his patents, his principles, his prior work. And he was not wrong about this. The 1943 Supreme Court would eventually weigh in on a narrow aspect of exactly that question, though the ruling was more complicated than the way it is usually summarized, a technical adjudication on specific patent claims, rather than a sweeping declaration that Tesla had invented radio and Marconi had stolen it. The truth of invention is almost never that clean. Ideas move through the air like the signals Tesla spent his life studying, and they carry traces of everyone who contributed to their propagation. But in December of 1901, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Morgan looked at the numbers coming out of Wardenclyffe and at the numbers coming out of the news about Marconi and performed the calculation that men like Morgan are paid to perform. The commercial case for the tower had rested on wireless communication. The wireless communication had been done cheaply by someone else. Morgan declined to add further funding. He declined politely. He declined with the particular finality of a man who has made up his mind and has no need to explain himself at length. There was correspondence. Tesla wrote letters that moved between pleading and grandiosity in the way that his mind moved between those 2 registers in those years, and Morgan's replies grew shorter and more conclusive, and eventually they stopped. Other investors followed Morgan's lead, because investors watch each other the way starlings watch each other, and when one large bird changes direction, the rest of them change direction too. The tower stood, the construction bills accumulated, the workmen thinned out. The vision remained entirely intact in Tesla's mind. Every detail of it preserved with the same clarity that had always characterized his interior designs: the rotating hemisphere, the underground routes, the receivers in London and in Paris, the lights coming on without wires, the planet differently powered. All of it still there, still vivid, still real to him, in a way that the world outside his skull was increasingly failing to match. The tower stood for another 16 years. It stood while Tesla moved between hotels and creditors and new schemes that never quite gathered enough momentum to become projects, and it stood while the world around it was wired in the ordinary way with ordinary copper and ordinary wooden poles, and it stood while its paint faded and its supporting structure aged, and its mushroom top became a landmark that the local community regarded with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The United States Army during the war determined that the tower might be useful to enemy forces as a reference point and ordered it demolished. In 1917 they brought it down. They used dynamite. It fell in sections, the steel hemisphere first, then the wooden shaft, then the buried iron roots, which resisted the explosives longer than the visible parts above the ground. By the time they were finished, there was nothing left of it except a concrete foundation and the building that had served as the laboratory, which still stands, and which has been preserved, and which sits quietly on the north shore of Long Island in a way that is either melancholy or simply old, depending on how you look at it. Tesla was not there when they demolished it. He had lost the property some years before, surrendered to creditors. He was in a hotel, counting. He was always counting. This is the part of the story that biographers sometimes separate from the rest, treating the compulsions as a medical footnote or a colourful detail rather than what they actually were, which was another expression of the same mind that had produced everything else, the same need for precision, the same inability to leave anything approximate, the same insistence on certainty in the face of a world that was not and had never been certain. The compulsions were not separate from the genius. They were made of the same material. He circled a building 3 times before entering it, not once, not twice. 3. If something interrupted the circuit, he would begin again, because a partial circle was not a circle and could not be allowed to stand as one. The number 3 had a quality that other numbers lacked, a solidity, a completeness, and he organized his approach to the world around it with the same methodical precision he had organized his approach to the design of an induction motor. The building had to be entered correctly, or it could not be entered at all. At dinner, and he dined at fine restaurants through the years when he could afford to, and continued to attempt to dine at them through the years when he could not. He required exactly 18 napkins. Not a stack of napkins. Exactly 18. He would count them before he sat down, and if the count was wrong, the count was corrected. 18 was a multiple of 3, and 3 was reliable in a way that other numbers had never managed to convince him they were. 18 napkins, folded and stacked, and then a meal eaten with a precision that would have seemed extraordinary even to people who had never watched a man design an electrical system in his head without drawing a diagram. He calculated the cubic volume of everything he consumed, not approximately. He had methods for estimating the volume of a serving of soup, of a glass of wine, of a piece of bread, and he applied these methods as a matter of course, as casually as another man might glance at a clock to note the time. The food had to be accounted for. The quantities had to be known. An unquantified meal was an imprecision, and imprecision was a thing he did not know how to tolerate in the laboratory or at the table. He could not bear pearls. The sight of them, the thought of them, the smooth, round absence of any feature that might allow the eye to rest, something about them produced a revulsion that he never satisfactorily explained, and perhaps could not have explained. Because these aversions did not arrive with explanations attached. They were simply present, as the visions had been simply present in childhood, appearing without invitation and demanding to be accommodated. Round objects more broadly troubled him. Not all of them, not in every context, but round objects in certain contexts, touching him or near him in ways he could not control, produced a physical discomfort that was real and immediate and not something he could argue himself out of, though he had tried. He had spent a lifetime arguing himself into and out of all manner of things. The round objects did not yield to argument. Human hair, in certain forms, produced a similar response, germs, and this was a compulsion that grew more pronounced as he aged. In a century that was only beginning to understand what germs were and what they could do, germs required management. He wore gloves. He insisted on cleanliness in ways that his contemporaries sometimes found excessive, and that would, in a later century with a more complete vocabulary for these things, be recognized as something specific and describable. None of this was incidental. This is what needs to be said slowly and clearly, because the compulsions and the genius were not two separate things that happened to coexist in the same person. They were products of the same underlying process, the same hunger for exactness, the same refusal to let any quantity go unverified, the same faith that if you counted carefully enough and arranged things precisely enough, the world would hold still long enough for you to understand it. The man who counted his napkins was the same man who ran a machine in his head for weeks, testing it under varying loads before he was satisfied that it would work. The man who could not enter a building without circling it 3 times was the same man who believed that the earth and the sky could be bridged with the right tower at the right frequency, and that energy would flow between them as naturally as water flows between 2 vessels at different heights when you open the channel between them. You cannot take one piece of this without the other. The counting was the same as the inventing, the same instrument, the same person. And the same person was, by the years after Wardenclyffe, running out of the kind of external support that allows instruments like his to function in the world. The money had come and gone, from Westinghouse, from Astor, from Morgan, and it had gone because Tesla's visions grew faster than his ability to deliver on them, because the gap between what he imagined and what he could build with the resources available to him widened as his ambitions expanded, because the world of investors is a world of returns, and Tesla was not, by the end, producing them. He had the Waldorf Astoria for a while. He owed them large sums. He moved. There were other hotels, other rooms, other dining rooms where the napkin count was conducted and the meal volumes were calculated and the food was eaten with the precision of a man who believed that precision was its own form of control over a world that had become, in certain tangible and material ways, uncontrollable. And then there was the Hotel New Yorker. Room 3327. He arrived there in the 1930s, and he did not leave. The hotel accommodated him, in part because he was Nikola Tesla. The name still meant something. The name was still attached to a coil that bore it, and to the unit of magnetic flux density that would eventually bear it, and to the photograph of the thin-faced man with the dark eyes that appeared in the newspapers when journalists wrote about what electricity was and where it had come from. And in part because there was something about the old man feeding pigeons on the street below the window that made it difficult to ask him to leave. He fed them every day. This is not a small detail. This is one of the things that those who knew him in those last years remembered most clearly. The old man in the long coat, thin in the way that very old men sometimes become thin, walking to the park or standing at the window of room 3327 with his pockets full of seed, the pigeons arranging themselves around him with the particular confidence of birds who have learned that this specific human is reliable. He spoke about the pigeons. He wrote about them. He described them with a warmth that he reserved for very few subjects, and which was notably absent from most of his descriptions of human beings, toward whom he maintained a quality of interested distance, respectful, often generous, sometimes admiring, but never quite the thing you could call closeness. The pigeons did not require negotiation. They came and ate from his hand, and they did not ask him to explain the tower, or to account for the money, or to justify the years. There was one pigeon, a white one. He described her, and he used the feminine pronoun she consistently as the great love of his life. He said this plainly, without apparent embarrassment, in the knowledge that it would be reported and perhaps mocked, as if the mockery were a price he had already calculated and found acceptable. She was white, and she was particular to him, and she came to him for years, and he loved her the way he had not quite managed to love a person, openly and without the counting. He said that when she died, he knew his work was finished. Not that the work was done. Finished, there is a difference between those two things, and he chose the word carefully, as he chose most words carefully, and the word he chose was the one that meant ended rather than completed. She died before he did. He continued. Room 3327. The window. The park. The thin old man moving through the city that his physics had helped to shape, in a long coat, with birdseed in his pockets, carrying the interior drawings of machines that would never now be built, towers that had already been dynamited, systems of planetary power transmission that would have to remain imagined, because the money had stopped, and the money would not come again. He died on the 7th of January, 1943. He was 86 years old. He died alone, in the room, in his bed, and it was a maid who found him, not a colleague or a friend or a family member. There was no one with him. Afterward, before the morning was out, representatives of the United States government arrived and took possession of his papers. The papers were examined by an electrical engineer named John G. Trump. He was thorough. He was competent. He reported, when he was finished, that the papers contained nothing of significant military value, no working death ray, no functional particle beam, nothing that could be weaponized in the ways that a government at war needed things to be weaponized. The notebooks were the notebooks of an extraordinary mind, but the extraordinary things they described were either already known or not yet within reach of the technologies available to build them, and the government, satisfied with this assessment, returned the papers to where they belonged and got on with the war. And that same year, 1943, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case called Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company against the United States, and in the course of deciding, it cited Tesla's prior work in ways that invalidated certain key Marconi patents. This is often reported as the court declaring Tesla the inventor of radio, and this is not quite what the court did. The court adjudicated a specific and complicated dispute about specific patent claims, and in the course of that adjudication, it acknowledged Tesla's priority on certain technical matters. The full history of who invented what in the development of wireless communication runs through many rooms and many countries and many minds, including Marconi's, including Tesla's, including others. And it does not resolve neatly into a single inventor standing alone at the beginning of it. But the ruling existed, and it acknowledged something real, and it arrived in the same year he died, as though the ledger was being settled while the account was still open. Now, we have been moving towards something all this time, and it is time to reach it. 2 hours a night. He said it himself. He said it to journalists, to admirers, to anyone who asked how he managed to work the way he worked, to sustain the focus he sustained, to produce what he produced. 2 hours a night. A reported 84 hours of continuous work in a single stretch. The capacity of a machine, not a man. He offered this information willingly, almost eagerly, in the way that a man offers the details of his own legend when he has decided, consciously or not, to participate in its construction. And the people around him described something else. They described naps. Daytime naps, taken with the ease of a man who had developed the practice into a reliable reflex. Not the secret naps of a man who napped in shame. Not the hidden sleep of someone trying to hide his need for rest from a disapproving world. He acknowledged the naps. He called them recharging his batteries, which is a phrase that reveals more than it intends, because batteries are things that discharge and require replenishment, and if you are recharging your batteries during the day, then the 2-hour figure for the night is not the whole picture. Those close to him described the long recovery sleeps that followed the marathon sessions. The deep sleeps that came after the 84 hours or however long the latest run had lasted, the collapses into rest that could extend for many hours, the body reclaiming what the mind had borrowed from it during the extraordinary stretch. These sleeps were not counted. They were not part of the 2-hour figure. The 2-hour figure was for the ordinary nights, the maintenance nights, the nights when nothing exceptional was happening, which is itself an interesting use of the word ordinary, applied to the sleeping arrangements of a man who considered 2 hours of sleep sufficient maintenance. And then there was the qualifier he gave, when pressed, when the arithmetic was pointed out, and found not to add up. He said he did not count light sleep. He said he counted only deep sleep, only the real thing, the genuine unconsciousness from which you cannot be easily roused, the dozing, the half-sleep, the light rest in a chair. These were not sleep, as he defined the term. They were something else. They were recharging. Do you see it? He had redefined the word, not fraudulently, not with the intention of deceiving anyone, or not primarily with that intention. He had drawn a line inside the concept of sleep and moved it to a position that kept the 2-hour figure alive, the same way he had drawn lines in the dirt of a Budapest park to keep the vision of the rotating field alive before any copper or iron existed to make it real. He was a man who believed in the clarity of definitions, who counted napkins because a count was a count and not an approximation, who calculated the volume of his soup because an estimated volume was not a known volume, and when the definition of sleep threatened the figure he had committed to, he clarified the definition. It is not a small thing, the precision with which he held this particular piece of his own story. It matches the precision with which he held everything. And then there is Edison. Edison, who was Tesla's rival and antagonist, who ran the fear campaign against alternating current and connected it to the electric chair in the public mind, who dismissed Tesla's rotating field and then watched the world rewire itself around it, Edison also claimed to sleep very little. 4 hours a night, he said, sometimes less. The busy, productive, historically significant man does not waste his hours on sleep. The inventor is not horizontal when the world needs inventing. It was not merely Tesla's boast. It was the age's boast, the performance of the self-made genius who burns while others rest, who needs less of the ordinary requirements because he is not an ordinary person. And Edison napped constantly. On cots in his laboratory, on chairs, on any available surface that presented itself at the moment when his body decided that the performance of minimal sleep had extracted its price and the debt needed to be paid. He was famous for this. The men who worked with him knew where to find the cots. The napping was not a secret. It was part of the texture of the Edison laboratory, the same way the napkin count was part of the texture of the Tesla dinner. Everyone knew, nobody tallied it against the official figure, and the official figure was what appeared in the newspapers and eventually in the histories. So here is the honest frame, delivered quietly, because this is not a debunking, this is a clarifying. And the distinction matters as much as the one Tesla drew between deep sleep and light sleep. The human body, even the body of someone with an extraordinary mind, requires sleep. The literature on this is long and consistent and does not leave much room for comfortable exceptions. The documented short sleepers, people who genuinely function on significantly less sleep than the average, exist. But they are rare, and even they do not typically function on 2 hours, and the capacities that tend to be most severely degraded by sleep deprivation are precisely the capacities that Tesla most prized. The visual spatial reasoning, the ability to hold a complex three-dimensional structure in the mind and rotate it and examine it from all sides. The sustained creative focus that allows a man to run a machine in his head for weeks and emerge with a design that works. These are not the things that survive the chronic deprivation of sleep. They are the first things to go. So the 2-hour claim, examined honestly, does not hold. But the interesting thing, the really interesting thing, the thing that the honest examination reveals, and that a simple debunking would miss entirely, is what the claim is instead. It is the same personality, that is all. It is the same instrument that produced the induction motor and the alternating current system, and the Colorado Springs lightning, and the tower that rose and fell at Shoreham. The same refusal of ordinary limits. The same insistence on the precision of a chosen number. The same inability to leave the definition where everyone else had left it. The same self-mythology, which was not vanity in the ordinary sense, but something more like the necessary fiction of a man who was trying to do things that had not been done, and who needed to believe that the doing of them was within reach, and who built the belief the way he built everything, carefully, specifically, with an exact number attached. He slept, he napped, he recovered. He rested in the long sleeps that followed the impossible stretches, and called the naps something other than sleep, and counted only the deep part, and arrived at a figure he could offer to journalists with the confidence of a man who has done the arithmetic and trusts his own definitions. And he lit the world. That is not a small thing to hold alongside the counting. The actual, real, verified, physically unambiguous fact is that the polyphase alternating current system that his mind produced, drawing the design in the dirt of a park in Budapest with a stick, working it into the patents of 1887 and 1888, presenting it to the electrical engineers in their auditorium and watching their faces change, is the system that runs through the walls of the room you are in right now. Not something like it. Not a descendant of it that is so many generations removed from the original that the connection is tenuous. The rotating magnetic field, the alternating wave, the transformer that steps the voltage up for transmission and down for use, these are the same things, the same principles, carrying current to the same places by the same mechanism that he drew in the park before he had a laboratory to test it in. Room 3327 is quiet now. The city outside it is lit, and the lights are on the system, and the old man who last slept in that room died in 1943 and has been gone for more than 80 years. The white pigeon is long gone. The tower at Shoreham is a concrete foundation and a preserved building and a historical marker. The Colorado Springs Laboratory no longer exists. The South Fifth Avenue building where the fire took the notes and the models burned to the ground in 1895 was replaced long ago by something else entirely. What remains is the current in the wall. And the notebooks. The papers that John G. Trump examined and found not to contain a working death ray, but which did contain the record of an extraordinary mind at work, the drawings made without paper, the machines tested without metal, the visions that arrived like the childhood flashes of light and were caught and held and turned into something that the world could use. And the claim. 2 hours a night, still circulating, still offered as a productivity insight, still repeated in the places where such things are repeated, still carrying the exact precision of the number the man himself chose and defended and clarified the definition of sleep to protect. There is something almost restful about understanding it, finally, not the debunking of it, the understanding, the recognition that the claim and the current are the same thing, products of the same instrument, the same refusal of limitation, the same insistence that if you count carefully enough and define precisely enough and believe completely enough in the interior design, the world will eventually catch up to the vision. He was not a man who slept 2 hours a night. He was a man who needed to believe he slept 2 hours a night and who arranged his definitions accordingly and who then went to work. There is, when you sit with it for a moment, a strange and specific comfort in that. Not because the redefinition was correct, but because the same mind that could not stop counting, the napkins, the volumes, the cubic measure of an evening meal, also could not stop inventing. The compulsion ran in both directions simultaneously. It drove him into the laboratory at 3 a.m, and it drove him to count his way through dinner, and it drove him to circle the block 3 times, and it drove him to the window of room 3327 with birdseed in his pockets, feeding the pigeons one at a time in the thin light of a New York afternoon. He was one person. The genius and the counting and the napping and the tower and the pigeon and the claim are all one person. That is the thing that a simple productivity story about 2 hours of sleep misses entirely, and that a simple debunking also misses, because both of them require that you isolate one piece and hold it up separately from the rest. And this particular life does not yield to that kind of handling. You have to take the whole thing, at the pace the whole thing deserves, in the order in which it actually happened, in the rooms where it actually occurred, with the real names and the real dates, and the honest acknowledgement of what is verified and what is legend, and what is the man's own telling of himself, which is its own kind of evidence. You have been doing that tonight, taking the whole thing. moving through it slowly, from Smiljan to the Budapest Park, to the South Fifth Avenue fire, to the Colorado Springs lightning, to the mushroom-shaped tower, falling in sections on the north shore of Long Island, to the quiet of room 3327, and the window and the white pigeon, and the 7th of January, 1943, when a maid knocked, and the door opened, and the room was still. The current in the wall has been running this whole time, the whole length of this telling. The same rotating field, the same alternating wave, the same system that began as a vision in a park and became a design scratched in the dirt and became a lecture in an auditorium and became a contract and became a set of generators at Niagara Falls, sending power to Buffalo, and became the grid. The vast invisible grid that underlies the lit world, running quietly, without announcement, through every wall and every building and every room where someone is lying in the dark tonight, listening to the story of the man who built it. He claimed he slept 2 hours a night. He slept more than that, and the sleeping was part of the same life, and the life was extraordinary. And the alternating current is real, and the tower is gone, and the pigeon is gone, and the man is gone, and the current is still running. That is enough to know. That is, perhaps, exactly enough. If you are somewhere in the world tonight, and this slow account has kept you company while the room went dark around you, I am glad for that. I would genuinely like to know where you are listening from. If you feel moved to say, the comments are there, and I do read them. If this kind of unhurried telling is what you come looking for, there are more of them here. More lives told slowly in the dark, more questions examined without urgency, waiting for whenever you want them. But now the night is far enough along, and you have followed a long and complicated life from its beginning to its end, and there is nothing more that needs to be resolved tonight. The current in the wall will run while you sleep, the rotating field will keep turning, the alternating wave will keep moving through the copper. The thing that was drawn with a stick in the dirt of a Budapest park in 1882 will continue doing what it was designed to do, unchanged and reliable and present, the way certain things in the world are simply present, without needing to announce themselves. You are moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off.